Education USA Advisor, the Fulbright Commission here in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Christopher and a lot of faculty from Drexel and the Grad College are very interested, and they want to talk about the PhD admission process and all the requirements and the different things that you need to know when you're thinking about applying. I think this is going to be very useful for all of you who are considering this option. And I just want you to know that all the Education USA advisors in Argentina, and now I'm going to tell you about the different centers that you have in the country, but we're here to help you with all the process. So in case you decide to apply, you should know that you can go to the different centers. We can do Skype or virtual advising, and we can help you throughout the process for free. Okay, we don't charge you for all the help and all the information that you may need. So we have 5 centers in Argentina. We have 2 in Buenos Aires at ICANA, the Binational Center, and at the Fulbright Commission, where I'm based. And also we have centers in Rosario, at Aricana, at Amicana in Mendoza, at ICANA in Córdoba. So those are the different centers that have advisors ready to help you. So in case you're in different provinces, this may be a very good option for you to stop by and visit. And we also organize these kind of events like webinars and online presentations quite often. So that's a very good option also for you. Así que bueno, muchas gracias a todos. El webinar va a ser en inglés y creemos que es una buena opción porque, bueno, para pensar en un PhD es importante que ya tengan el nivel de inglés y creo que no van a tener ningún problema con eso. Y el webinar va a ser sobre todo el proceso de aplicación a un PhD y también obviamente sobre lo que es la Universidad de Drexel, sobre todo lo que es Graduate College y el proceso de admisión. Así que en el caso de que después tengan preguntas, siempre pueden realizarlas. Y para que sepan, mi email es gdubin@fulbright.com.ar y ahí pueden recibir información y les puedo también acercar recursos y buscadores. Y siempre estamos en las redes sociales, en Education USA Argentina, en Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Okay. So, well, thank you very much, Christopher, for organizing this, and it's a pleasure to have you here giving this webinar.
Thank you very much, Giselle. I'm just going to say a few words before I let my colleague, Professor David Goldberg, lead the webinar. Welcome. We hope that you learn a lot through this webinar. Our intent here is to be helpful to all those of you who are thinking about applying to do a doctoral program or a PhD somewhere in the United States. If you are online, please pull up the chat function as we're going through. Professor Dandekar from the Electrical Engineering Department and myself, I'm with the Department of Economics in the Business School. We will be online to answer questions via chat, and we may come on at the end where there'll be an open period for questions and answers. I would also like to let you know that for joining us today via this webinar, as long as you logged in using your email address, we will be able to send you an application waiver fee, or application fee waiver, if you choose to apply to any of the programs here at Drexel. But in general, this webinar is really about applying to any PhD program anywhere in the United States. But if you want more information about our specific programs at Drexel University, we have some links at the end, and we'd be more than happy to answer those questions as well. So with that, let me turn it over to Professor Goldberg to lead the webinar. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. I want to make sure that you do not wait until the end to ask any questions you might have. We tried to cover a lot of bases in this presentation, but things will occur to you about your specific case or specific programs. I will post my email address right now. And for students who maybe have specific questions pertaining to for their own education, who want to have questions about those, you can send me an email. For some reason, it's giving me a little bit of trouble. I'll try again in a moment, saying everyone is not in session. There we are. So this presentation was put together by people in a wide range of disciplines. Our colleague Penny Hamrick was not able to join us today, but Professor Dandekar, Professor Laincz will both be in the chat window throughout, and they can answer any sorts of questions you have. And again, if there are questions specifically about arts and sciences that you think I might want to address directly, I'll be happy to handle them at the end, or as I say, I've posted my email address. So we're going to be talking today about sort of the soup to nuts, beginning to end application process for graduate school, what you can expect for PhD programs in the United States in terms of academic expectations, social expectations, financial expectations. But our outline today is basically going to be, what is your motivation? Why do a PhD? We'll talk about different types of doctoral and other graduate programs, at least peripherally at the beginning. We'll talk about what you can do with a PhD at the end of your degree, various career paths. We'll sort of circle back to the beginning and describe what the application requirements are. Professor Laincz will jump in for a few minutes and talk about some international student considerations, as he is our local expert on that. And then we'll make sure to leave time at the end for some questions and answers that didn't get dealt with during the main presentation. So we'll start with a quote. Completing a PhD is a long, hard road with many potholes and washed out bridges. You may run over some landmines and have to stop and turn around to explore other routes. If the goal is important enough to you, then these obstacles will not prevent you from completing your journey, which is a rather dire way to start, perhaps. But what we're trying to say is that unlike an undergraduate education where you go in and you have a list of classes that you need to take, and you might, if you know what major you're going to take, you might be able to plan out your entire four-year education from the outset. A PhD almost never works that way. There's research involved, and whenever research is involved, things get messy. That can mean that you take some wrong turns. But if you've made some good decisions from the outset, if you've got a program that's supportive, if you've got an environment that's supportive, if you've got a clear idea of what you'd like to do, you will hopefully be able to produce some really excellent work and have a degree that you'll be able to be really proud of. So let's begin by talking about why do a PhD in the first place. A PhD, unlike a master's degree typically, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, is a very research-focused degree. That is the main part of it. Though there is always coursework involved, research is sort of the core to getting the actual doctorate. And so we are looking for students, other universities are looking for students who are passionate about doing the research and extending it to later in their careers, that they're devoted to learning, that they're interested in intellectual pursuits within, and there's lots of options, educational, professional, and societal sectors. And a PhD is generally, in many disciplines, considered the preparation degree for a career in academia. As a professor, as a researcher in many types of labs, as a curator, senior curator in a museum, that sort of thing. So you can have both professional and personal reasons for wanting to pursue the PhD. So we are not going to read through all of the elements of this chart. This is sort of meant to give you a snapshot. And of course, we are recording this. Are we recording this? I believe we're recording this. Chris?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So we're recording this. So if you want to go back and look at this particular slide after the fact, I would encourage you to do so. But what we've tried to spell out here is what are the different types of graduate degrees that you might want to consider? And the left is the main focus of today's discussion. And so I already sort of discussed the sort of career goals that you might want to get involved in. I mentioned academia, research institutes, government jobs. Entrepreneurship is a pretty exciting one as well. I mean, the professional training in terms of research that you do in many fields, including engineering, including many of the sciences, including business, and economics can really prepare you to go out and start companies or join startups and that sort of thing. It is designed to provide very intensive training, to produce high quality research, to sort of work with world experts, to get a deep and broad specialized knowledge base. So unlike perhaps an undergraduate education where you might take lots of courses that you're interested in but aren't specifically related to your field, the courses that you'll take on the way to your PhD are very, very focused on getting you to be a content expert in your particular discipline. And then ideally as well, you are training to be able to pass on that knowledge to other people. And so that includes training as an instructor for higher ed at the university level. Many programs, students come straight out of bachelor's degrees, and you sort of get a master's degree essentially along the way once you've completed your coursework or been admitted to candidacy. There are some programs that having a master's degree is actually helpful. And most programs you can come in with either a bachelor's or a master's and continue on to the degree. Just to sort of give you sort of the brief version of what some of the other graduate degrees are, there are what are called terminal master's degrees, where you're basically getting a deep knowledge in a particular discipline. These might be in industry or government work. They might be a stepping stone to a PhD program, or they might not. Many times educators at the high school level get master's degrees to sort of show greater mastery of their material, and frequently pay raises go along with that. There are professional masters, like the MBA in business, where that is the terminal degree, and it's basically meant to show expertise. And then there are professional doctorates, and typically these were going to come after you've been in a field for a very long time, where you're looking to have sort of a more research-oriented background, and typically will take something like that in order to advance in your career. But as I say, today we're going to be focusing on the first column, PhDs in the United States. I sort of glossed over this in the previous slide, but just to compare and contrast masters, and in particular masters in science or masters in art versus PhDs. In master's degrees, you're typically getting an increased knowledge, usually through coursework. Many of them have a research component, but with PhD, it's the main component. You might spend a couple of years doing coursework and some research in a PhD, and then virtually all of your next 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 years will be spent almost exclusively doing research. So somebody who's going to pursue a PhD program should have a love of learning, scientific discovery, becoming an expert, and developing new information that no one has learned before. In terms of professional preparation, obviously I've used the word research probably about 100 times so far. So it is unsurprising that a PhD prepares you for a degree in research. You are going to be potentially a thought leader in your field. You'll publish. A big part of what you're going to do is develop not only new information, but you're going to share that with the world. So for example, I'm a physicist. It is very, very common for students during their PhD program to be the lead author on major journal papers, to present those papers, not just in journals, but to present them at national conferences and international conferences, to make connections, to become an independent researcher, an independent scientist, as well as making discoveries that can have effects on the broader society. Talking about your specific discipline, talking about what you've learned, talking about what you've developed, that's an important part of the process as well. So as a result, a big part of what you do is you learn how to share that knowledge. Because we sort of describe the career pipeline of a PhD, and in some cases that ends in being a professor, it maybe doesn't surprise you that part of what we're preparing for is to ultimately go out and become a professor to teach classes, to work with students, and to sort of start that cycle anew. And that is part of the professional training. Many PhD programs, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, as part of their process will require you or will allow you to work as a teaching assistant or sometimes even a lead instructor on classes for younger students, for undergraduates. And that's a big part of your mastery of material, is your ability to present it to other people. In terms of career expectations, most PhDs are going to go on to areas like academia, universities and so forth, research, teaching. People sometimes will get their PhDs and then go on to teach at the high school level, or in public sector, or through museum or other outreach units. In addition, there are tons of opportunities, especially again in areas like engineering, in economics, to go into industry, nonprofit, government jobs will frequently hire PhDs as well. And because the PhD is considered such a rigorous degree, there is enormous demand for PhDs in consulting. By way of sort of personal experience, when I was getting my PhD in astrophysics, and this was a number of years ago, our campuses were swarmed basically by recruiters looking for students to work in management consulting firms, even though our degrees were not remotely related to that. The idea that you had sort of a high-end degree, that you'd been able to demonstrate that you can think critically, follow very large projects from beginning to end, that was seen as excellent career preparation as well. In terms of what to expect for time commitment, a typical degree program takes 4 to 6 years for a PhD. If you're starting with a master's, might be a little bit more reasonable, more toward the 6 end. If you're starting with a bachelor's, is probably reasonable. But there's a lot of variables that go into that. Typically, you will spend the first 2 years on doing some sort of coursework. That can be very, very rigorous, more or less at the end, at the level of what you might have seen as an undergraduate, where you're taking several courses a term, and then some programs you might take only 1 or 2 courses per term. And then you will support yourself in one of a few ways. So let me sort of jump ahead to what we'll discuss later on, which is the cost of a PhD. Many PhD programs, and this depends on school and this depends on discipline, will find a way to support you. And what that support will mean is that they give you free tuition, basically, and they give you a stipend. There are also ones that give you partial support, and there are some programs that give you no support. It is very important before you look at an individual program that you know which is which, and we can provide some guidance. I will say, for example, in the natural sciences, it is very unusual to be admitted to a PhD program without the expectation of support. But it really does vary by discipline. And the way that you're supporting yourself might be initially through a teaching assistantship, and that means grading papers or working with small groups of students or smaller groups of students. Occasionally, it may mean that you are lecturing on your own. Research, and that generally, if you're supported by your research, that may mean that the faculty member has a grant from a foundation or a federal agency, and that they have money specifically to do a project and specifically to support a student on that project. And that, again, will be your full tuition and your stipend. During this, regardless of how you're supported, you will typically work very, very closely with a faculty advisor, faculty mentor on a project. Now, what does that mean? That means that not that they will look over your shoulder, not that you're going to punch in every day necessarily. There's a huge amount to which you need to be self-motivated. You need to be able to work on the project independently for long stretches of time, but you're not going to be completely on your own. You will have a faculty mentor who will help you define the project, who will help you figure out sort of the most important parts of the project, who will be a great sounding board for you, ideally, and you will hopefully have a good relationship with them where you'll be able to grow as a researcher, as a scholar. And so a big part of finding the right graduate program for you may be finding programs where you have a faculty advisor that you'll really be able to succeed with. As part of the process, there is typically some sort of candidacy exam. So in many cases, I say you come in with a bachelor's degree, you maybe get a master's degree along the way, and then you get a PhD. A candidacy exam can be at the point where you go from bachelor's to master's. But even if you come in with a master's degree, the idea is that you will do something like demonstrate sort of expertise in the coursework. So this might be a written exam in some disciplines, in some schools. It might be an oral presentation about what you've learned so far. It might be an oral presentation on an early project, or it can be some sort of presentation or report on what you plan on doing for your actual PhD thesis, the final written project that will consume the rest of your time. So there are a lot of different models for that, but you should expect that between when you arrive and well before you finish, you will have a point at which you basically have to really define, your project, and you sort of have to pass an exam of some sort. At the end is the main event. You will write a dissertation. These vary very widely depending on the discipline. They can be relatively short, relatively long. And then there is a defense in front of a committee, typically of roughly 5 people. It depends on the discipline and the institution. Sometimes they are public, sometimes they are not. But almost all of them end basically with, after this talk, getting grilled, having the committee ask you really hard questions about your work, about its place in the broader discipline and all the rest of it. Being somebody who's been on the other side of that now many years, I can say it's a grueling experience that you don't forget, but I think it's absolutely worthwhile in the sense that it really makes you think about the role that your research plays. Thinking about what you do over the course of your PhD to help you develop professionally. We've talked a lot about the overall development of a researcher, the actual research itself, but over the course of the degree, you're going to be going to seminars. These may be local seminars within the department. Some have what they call journal club, where students and faculty get together and read a recent paper together, and somebody gives a talk on it. But this can also mean going to conferences, nationally, internationally. And initially, perhaps you're going to mostly learn and listen. But as time goes on, a successful student will frequently present at these sorts of things and go and present the work from your group or your lab or yourself to the broader community, make collaborations, and make a reputation for yourself. While it is not the general rule in the United States that students write grants themselves, some programs do have students write grants that might fund them. It is very common, especially as you become a more senior student, to produce material for a faculty member who's writing a grant, again, to a granting agency or federal funding agency. And maybe this means just a figure or a data table, or maybe it means entire passages that describe what the importance and results of your work are. Again, as you sort of move up, in addition to writing papers, you will be seen as a content expert in your field, and then you will be asked by academic journals to look at other people's papers, to decide whether those people's papers are appropriate to be in the journals. So you will be asked to referee. I described being a teaching assistant. Obviously, there's the teaching experience, but also as you sort of rise up in seniority, other students may join your lab or your group, and you may end up finding yourself being an older mentor to perhaps an undergraduate or a more junior graduate student within your group, and you may find yourself sort of more informally teaching them. So I mentioned this earlier. I felt it was important to sort of describe the fact that many students do get financial support during their time in their PhD program. Many programs provide full or partial support for 4 to 5 years. This means a stipend and tuition. Stipends vary widely in the United States, but they are generally designed so that you can get an apartment that you could share, that you could afford, not to live lavishly, but that you could afford ramen, and you know, that you won't incur additional debt while you're in school. Partial support may mean tuition only or stipend only. Some programs do not fund you until you reach the 2nd or 3rd year, which coincidentally is around the time that you are officially admitted for candidacy. At Drexel, just as an example, we provide full support, including tuition, stipend, and then sometimes there's some additional funding like money to travel for conferences and health insurance. And some of these end up being competitive, where you need to apply to a central office at the university, and you may or may not get it. But we want you to succeed, so that's part of the whole process. Okay, so that's the pipeline when you're within graduate school. Let's think about applications and sort of getting to graduate school. So a big part of the application process is identifying where you'd like to go, and this involves a lot of factors. So, for example, Drexel is in a fairly large city in the United States, about halfway between Washington, D.C. and New York. Very livable, it's very walkable, it's quite affordable compared to other major cities in the US. And for me coming here professionally, that was a very big draw. Other people may prefer an environment that is much quieter than a city. Others may prefer to live in an even bigger city. That's going to be an important part of your consideration. And because you're spending 4, 5, 6 years in this program, it is important that you pick a place that's important. You will want to look at the quality of the school. There are various accrediting agencies, ABET, US News and World Report. There are websites you can go to where you can rank PhD programs based on, like phds.org, based on the size of the program and the amount of funding that students typically get, and things like that. And you can get a general sense of the ranking of programs, and generally speaking, the higher ranked are more desirable. But there's always going to be specific considerations. If there's a specific subdiscipline that you are very, very interested in, it's important that that program actually do that. If there's a person or people that you'd really like to work with, well, then those programs that they work at, the universities that they work at, should be higher up on your list. Once you've got a long list, you're gonna wanna make sure that you go to the websites of those institutions, look at where their faculty are publishing, what their students are currently doing. Ideally, if they have student outcome lists, then you should look at that as well. And when you're doing this, you should have at least a couple of names of people that you would be happy or excited to work with if you're admitted into the program. If they do webinars or online informational sessions, by all means, for a particular program, by all means you should attend. And of course, Education USA is set up precisely to help you with this sort of search. There's no hard and fast number about how many schools you should be applying to. Many schools have an application fee. As Professor Laincz said earlier, if you are interested in applying specifically to Drexel in your program and you send him a message, a private message through Zoom with your name and your email address, we will be able to provide a waiver for Drexel's application fee. But in general, there's going to be a fee, and those can add up. So you should think about how many schools you're going to apply to, and at some point it's going to be too expensive. The other reason, by the way, that you might want to keep your search somewhat limited, 10 being sort of an upper limit in most cases, is that you will generally want to personalize your various statements. Most universities require a research statement or a personal statement or something like that. And if you just write generically, it's not going to get the same level of attention as if you are writing about why this particular school interests you and which particular faculty or which particular part of the program interests you. So you want to think about that rather than just sending out a huge number of applications that are very, very generic. The other factor that can typically come into this is the size of the program. There are some graduate programs that have hundreds of students. There are some graduate programs where they might have 4 or 5 a year. The large programs are going to have a cohort that you can work with. That's a good thing. But on the other hand, large programs are typically large because they know that a certain number of students are going to fail out or leave because they're unhappy. It may be harder to get individual attention. That said, some of the best programs in the country are schools that attract a huge number of students, and thus the classes are just going to be large, and that's how it is. So you're going to want to look into that and ideally talk to people who know about the individual program. What are the requirements as you're applying? So typically, there's some sort of standardized test. The GRE is very common in the sciences and humanities and social sciences and engineering. The GMAT, for example, is going to be required in other programs. If you're coming from a foreign country, you may have to take the TOEFL or another language exam. I've already referred to the statement of purpose, which is another piece of the application, your personal statement. You should think very, 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 very deeply about what you want to say. You should think very, very deeply about which advisors you want to work with, what in your personal experience sort of makes you well suited to the program. You should edit your statement of purpose carefully, and ideally have other people look at it as well and give you feedback. Both content experts and people who are going to look at how things are worded and how they're presented. Most programs will require 2 or 3 letters of recommendation. Some require 4. Those are rarer. They should almost always come from someone who has a PhD and who knows you professionally. There are, as with all of these things, there can be exceptions, but you should think deeply about who's writing your letter. As a couple of pieces of advice, the first is if you ask someone for a letter of recommendation and they say that they don't think it would be a good idea, take that at face value. It means that they were not going to write you a good letter and you should move on to someone else. The other piece of advice I want to give you is think about what the letter writer knows about you uniquely, which is to say, if you've just had a class with somebody and you got a high mark in the class, and that's really all they can say about you, well, that information will already be available from your transcript. On the other hand, if you've done research with someone and published a paper with them, if they were your faculty mentor, they saw you grow over the course of 4 years, that's going to be somebody who might have a more interesting insight into your professional development and might be able to write you a stronger letter. And ideally, as I say, someone who you've done research with. All transcripts, and if the transcript is not in English, you'll be required to have it evaluated by professional service. As I mentioned, you do not need a master's degree, and for PhD programs, you do not need work experience. That said, it is not uncommon for some work experience or for master's degrees to help you get admitted to some programs. Okay, what are things that are going to be good indicators for chances of getting success, accepted especially at sort of higher ranked schools? Well, research experience is going to be a biggie, and I mentioned that that's going to typically show up in the letters of recommendation. strong GRE or GMAT scores. And by the way, we say just GRE generically. There's a general exam that tests that tests English and tests math skills. But there's also, in many areas, a subject exam that you might or might not be required to take to get into a particular program, especially in many areas of the sciences. You should look at the specific degree application requirements at any given program that you're looking at, whether they require an exam, and if so, whether there is a hard cutoff in the application in their acceptance. Letters of recommendation, good interviews. Many programs, but not all, require an interview. Sometimes these will be over Skype or phone. You should have a good reason for pursuing the degree. Regardless of anything else, this is going to be a 4 to 6 year commitment on your part. And so you should really have you should really understand your own motivations. Ideally, later in the process, you should seriously think about a visit if you can afford it and if it can be arranged. If you're able to do so, and if they don't require an in-person interview anyway. And then also, as I said, make sure that the research interests of the faculty are aligned with your own. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Chris for just a moment, Professor Laincz for just a moment, to describe the issues involved in international applications.
Sure, thank you. Just really quickly, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. If you have visa questions related to applying to programs in the United States, I honestly recommend you use your Education USA offices. They are excellent. We have worked with them for many, many years, and they have always do a fantastic job with helping our international students navigate what can be an intimidating visa process, but they can make it much, much easier for you. So just very briefly, if you come as a PhD student, you typically come on one of two visas. There's the F1, which is the standard, which allows you to come here to a university. You are also allowed to work, but only at the university. And in a PhD program, that matters because it means you're allowed to work here within the university as a teaching assistant, as a research assistant, and receive a stipend for that. If you are on a J1 visa, that is typically a visa that you are granted if you have external funding. So if a home government or a foundation provides you with funding, normally they would then assign you to a J1 visa. Sometimes J1 visas have requirements that you return to Argentina in this case and work there for a few years after you complete your PhD. And you want to check those requirements very carefully. They would be coming from your host government or the foundation that funds you. But that said, in your application, the one main point I want to make here is that you should make, if you are funded and going to take a J1 visa, you should definitely make sure that is noted in your application. It can help increase your chances of being accepted because it means someone else is paying for it, which means you're less costly to the universities here. It's no guarantee that you'll get in, even if you're completely funded. Everyone will still hold to their academic standards, but it is nice to have someone else providing you with support. And often you can get more generous support from foundations like that. And that's really all I have to say on the international student information. So we can go back to the webinar. And I think next up is just questions and answers.
Yep, sure is. So thank you very much. We can take questions. We can take questions in the sidebar, and we'll answer them a mix of sidebars and audibly. So thank you very much, everyone. So questions.
Please don't be shy. We're more than happy to answer your questions. We did another webinar like this a little earlier with a group that was constantly giving us questions. So please don't be shy. We're very happy to answer whatever you have. I noted that a couple people here are interested in the political science area, one person in applied economics. We can be a little bit more specific with questions to the field you're interested in if you would like. We'll do our best. But while we're waiting to see, let me remind you, as long as you registered for this webinar with an email address that we can reach and your name, we will send that to our enrollment management team, and they will offer you an application fee waiver. That should come to you by email at some point in the near future. Professor Goldberg, do you want to take that question?
So, so we offer a huge number of programs. So the question was, what programs do Drexel offer? In what area? We obviously have a very comprehensive set of programs in sciences, biology, environmental science, chemistry, physics, math, psychology. You can see the full list here. We thought ahead to produce the link, as well as an engineering college, our business school. So I mean, there's a huge. I think we have something like 100 programs university-wide and PhDs. So there's quite a lot to there's quite a lot at the university.
And if I can add to that, not sure if Professor Goldberg mentioned, we're about 26,000 students. Drexel's a fairly large university right in the heart of Philadelphia. If you're not familiar with Philadelphia, it's the 6th largest city in the United States. It's actually one of the sort of up and coming hot cities to live in. It is, within 2 hours of both New York City and Washington, D.C., but it's a much more livable city. It's a much lower cost place than those two. But it's very cosmopolitan. It's very, very welcoming of international students. Drexel in particular is very welcoming of our international students. It's what makes our university such a great place to be, because we have a very big mix of students from abroad. So please take a look at our website if you have an opportunity, see what we're all about. We have, as Professor Goldberg said, many programs at the graduate level and even more at the undergraduate level.
Yeah, I also want to jump on a question too that someone asked in the Mariana asked in the chat, and Professor Gandhikar answered about whether classes start in January. Most of our programs do indeed start in September, but the other thing to realize about PhD programs is, while there are some that have what is called rolling admission, we'll sort of look at your application at any time, most PhD programs have sort of a specific application period. And so for admission for next September, most students are starting to apply around now. So the deadlines might be in December or January, sometimes a little earlier, sometimes a little bit later for then. So do make sure that for any given program that you're looking at, you look at what the deadline is. Other questions?
Okay, everyone, if there's no more questions, we really appreciate your joining us today. We hope the webinar was helpful. I think we'll repeat in here our email addresses if you think of any more questions coming up. You can reach out to us with those. We would like to thank Giselle and the Education USA offices in Argentina for hosting us today. It's always a pleasure, and we hope to see your applications with us at some point in the future. So Giselle, do you want to close out? Do you have any last things to say?
Thank you very much for all the information. I think it was very helpful for everyone attending the webinar. In case you also want to contact Education USA offices, so you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and my email is heduvin@fulbright.com.ar. por si quieren que los ayude en el proceso. And if you have more questions, you can contact Professor Christopher, or you can also contact me. Okay. There's some more. I see that there's some more questions. I don't know, Christopher.
We will answer those questions. If you have a few more questions, I can stay on to continue to answer them. I see there's one from Alexia right now that I'm working on answering, but you know, we can hang around for just a little bit longer. Alexia, overall, I'd say that that's a good score. It, however, is program and university dependent. So most universities will put up on their website somewhere sort of what their expected scores are. I know for our PhD programs in business, we look, generally, we don't have a strict minimum, but we'll often look for scores that are at least in the 90 range. So a 101 is good. We will sometimes break that down into, you know, speaking or writing or those different components. And that depends upon, if I recall correctly, were you one of the political science? So was it in political science or international relations, perhaps? Yeah, if I recall correctly. Please look at those programs specifically. They may value something a little bit stronger than others. Other programs are going to be heavily weighted towards like math skills. That needs to show up in your GREs. But 101 overall seems like quite a good score. Oh, I see the follow-up question. I missed it. For an MA program, the standards are usually a little bit lower. It's for the PhD program that they're much, much higher. The best evidence of solid English skills are if you come here first for the MA and successfully complete that, that demonstrates that you're capable of handling an environment that's purely in English. That's all that many universities, including Drexel, if you have a degree from a recognized English-speaking university, we waive the TOEFL or the IELTS. We don't even need it if you've already gotten a degree. Okay. And I think that's it for the questions. Again, one last time, let me thank everyone for joining us and participating today. If you have any other questions, please email me. Oh, I see Alexia got one last one in. Yes, I mean, most programs do look at the verbal part of the GRE. It's, again, the GREs, the GMATs, all the standardized exams. You want to do well on those for a PhD program, there's no doubt. But most programs will look at your entire application. What I mean by that is, if your scores are on the weaker side, if you're very strong in other areas, you may still be considered. But you could have perfect scores and still not get admitted. We reject plenty of people who have pretty much perfect math scores and nearly perfect verbal scores because they don't fit with us very well. And other programs will do the same. We're looking for people who are interested in doing research that fits with the type of research we're doing. And that's actually much more important. Okay, last question, and we're done. Thank you again. We're going to, this webinar, if you ever want to come back to it, the recording will eventually be available up on probably the Education USA website at some point in time. We'll send that out to them. I hope to hear from you all again soon. I hope to see your applications. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giselle. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.